A man falls into a trance at sunset, and while he's unconscious, something on fire walks alone through a corridor of dead animals split in half. He wakes up the next morning, bound to a promise he never actually agreed to keep. That's not a horror story. That's Genesis chapter 15. And it's one of the strangest scenes in the entire Bible. So strange that most sermons quietly skip past it on the way to the parts that are easier to explain. You've heard covenant 1,000 times in church. God's covenant with Abraham, God's covenant with Israel, the new covenant, the old covenant. It sounds like a word for a contract, something signed and filed away. Comfortable. Bureaucratic, almost. But the scene where God actually establishes his covenant with Abraham involves a knife, a row of carcasses, birds of prey, a supernatural darkness, and a smoking object moving through blood on its own. Nobody puts that on a church bulletin. Most Bibles just call it the covenant and move straight into the promises attached to it. Descendants like the stars, land from the Nile to the Euphrates. Case closed. Skip the strange part in the middle. Except the strange part in the middle isn't decoration. It's the entire mechanism. Miss it, and you miss what Abraham was actually being told that night. Because in the ancient Near East, cutting a covenant wasn't a metaphor. It was a physical ritual with a very specific, very violent grammar attached to it. And once you understand the grammar, this scene stops being bizarre and starts being terrifying in a completely different way. Here's how the ritual worked across the ancient world, documented in treaties from Mari, from the Hittites, from Assyrian records centuries before and after Abraham. Two parties entering a binding agreement would take animals, often a calf, sometimes several, and cut them in half, laying the pieces in 2 rows with a path down the middle. Then both parties would walk together between the halves. The act itself was the oath. It said, without needing a single word attached to it, "If I break this agreement, let what happened to these animals happen to me." The blood on the ground wasn't just symbolic mess. It was the terms of the contract, spelled out in the most physical language available to Bronze Age people, a threat so unambiguous that breaking a covenant sealed this way was considered one of the gravest violations a person could commit. Now put Abraham into that scene and watch what actually happens, because it isn't what you'd expect from a normal ancient covenant ceremony. God tells Abraham to bring a heifer, a goat, a ram, a dove, and a young pigeon. Abraham cuts the large animals in half, exactly as the ritual demanded, arranging the pieces opposite each other, birds left whole beside them. Then he waits, and birds of prey start descending on the carcasses, a detail so specific it reads like an eyewitness account, not a symbolic flourish. And Abraham has to actively drive them off all day, guarding the pieces from scavengers under the desert sun. As the sun goes down, something happens to Abraham that the text describes almost clinically. A deep sleep falls on him, and with it, in the Hebrew, a great and terrifying darkness. Not peaceful sleep, not a comfortable vision. Terror descends on him along with the darkness. The text uses the word specifically to signal dread, not awe. And while he's unconscious, unable to participate, God tells him what's coming. 400 years of slavery for his descendants in a foreign land, before they come out with great possessions and return to this land in the 4th generation. Then, once it's fully dark, the ritual finally happens, but not the way ancient covenant ceremonies normally worked. A smoking firepot and a blazing torch appear and pass between the halves of the animals. Alone. Abraham never gets up. Abraham never walks the path between the pieces. In every other covenant ceremony like this one across the ancient Near East, both parties walk together, both sides binding themselves equally to the same threat. Here, only one party walks, represented by fire and smoke, ancient and immediately recognizable images of God's presence, echoing the pillar of fire and cloud that would lead Israel out of Egypt centuries later. Abraham stays where he fell, unconscious, terrified, and utterly passive, while God alone assumes the entire weight of the oath. This is the detail that should stop you cold, because it inverts the entire logic of the ritual. In a normal covenant of this kind, God walking through the pieces should mean God is also agreeing. If I break this, let what happened to these animals happen to me. But Abraham doesn't walk, which means, in the ancient grammar of this exact ceremony, God isn't just accepting a mutual obligation, God is taking on Abraham's side of the oath as well as his own. The covenant becomes entirely unconditional, resting on God's word alone, sealed by a threat God directs solely at himself. For a promise Abraham did nothing to secure and everything to receive. Compare this to what happens later, at Sinai, when Israel as a nation enters covenant with God through Moses, a covenant explicitly built on mutual obligation, blessings for obedience, curses for disobedience, both parties bound to conditions. Genesis 15 is different in exactly this structural way, and ancient readers steeped in covenant ritual would have caught the asymmetry instantly, the way a modern reader would notice if only one party signed a contract that bound them both. Abraham receives a covenant that costs him nothing to keep and everything to God to fulfill, which reframes the 400 years of slavery embedded right in the middle of the ceremony. This isn't a footnote God forgot to mention. It's placed directly inside the covenant-cutting scene itself, in the exact moment of terror and darkness, as if the suffering to come was somehow bound up in the very oath being sworn. The promise of land and descendants and the prophecy of centuries of slavery arrive in the same breath, sealed by the same fire, because the covenant was never a guarantee that the road would be easy, only a guarantee about who would still be walking it at the end, unconditionally, regardless of what Abraham's descendants did or didn't deserve along the way. This is why, centuries later, when the author of Hebrews wants to explain why God's promise can be trusted absolutely, he reaches back to exactly this scene, noting that because there was no one greater for God to swear by, God swore by himself, guaranteeing the promise with an oath that made it, in the writer's own words, impossible for God to lie. The unilateral, one-sided ritual in Genesis 15 becomes, generations later, the theological bedrock for the entire argument that God's covenant promises don't depend on human performance to hold. The covenant of the pieces has outlasted every treaty ritual it was modeled on. The Hittite Empire that practiced ceremonies like this one is gone. Its treaty tablets sitting in museum cases now, deciphered by scholars who had to relearn a ritual grammar the ancient world once understood instantly. The specific practice of walking between split carcasses to seal an oath eventually faded out of use everywhere it had once been common. And still, this one scene survived, preserved in exact and strange detail because the terror in it was never accidental. It was the entire point, a promise so serious that only fire could be trusted to carry the weight of it alone. The question in that darkness is still open. The covenant of the pieces. Not a comfortable handshake, not a contract with the fine print smoothed over for easier reading. A binding oath that one party swore entirely alone, walking through blood and smoke in the dark, for a promise the other party had done absolutely nothing yet to earn. So the next time you hear God's covenant said easily, like a settled legal term, stop and ask what it means that the promise binding your story to God's was sealed by a fire that walked through the dark completely by itself, while the one it was made for lay there, unconscious, unable to do anything but receive it.